Hello, and welcome to Retroscoping, a podcast tracing the evolution of feature animation. We're beginning our journey watching through the films that started it all from Disney Animation Studio, and today we're entering a world of sound and color, a world of Fantasia. I'm one of your hosts, Nathan, and I'm joined by...
Alexa!
Alexa, why are we qualified to do this podcast?
Well, I don't know about you, but I was a theater major, so I'm all about microphones and podcasting.
That's good. And even if you weren't qualified, you could act like you were qualified.
Exactly. Darn it. You know my secret.
Welcome to Retroscoping, where we act like experts.
What do you... We are experts. I don't know what you're talking about.
So, as experts...
Definitely experts.
Absolutely experts. Let's talk about Fantasia.
Released in 1940, later on in the year than Pinocchio. Shares the same year.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Mm-hmm. Pinocchio came out in February, and Fantasia comes out in November.
1940 was actually a really incredible year at the cinema.
Yeah, for animation. Really bad year for history.
True, but it's also the year of Gone with the Wind, and Wizard of Oz, and Stagecoach, and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, and a host of other classics we still watch and talk about today. I thought about it in particular because the opening sequences of Fantasia are live action, filmed silhouetted against these brilliantly golden-colored backgrounds. And the cinematography in them is quite sophisticated, quite lovely in its composition and use of color and light. And I thought, I'm not that familiar with film history and its evolution over particular decades. And this came off as a bit more abstract and artistic and sophisticated than I thought cinematography at the time was. But looking back at the kind of films that were coming out, it really was a pretty spectacular time for filmmaking.
A couple things to know when you start watching Fantasia, and I thought that the conductor and the person talking to me on screen were all the same person. Lo and behold, not only are they separate people, but they're pretty cool in their own rights. There is the Master of Ceremonies, Deems Taylor, who welcomes you to the program and does all of the speaking in this film.
Except for when Mickey appears to chat with him.
That's what we at Disneyland call a magical moment. Anyway, Deems Taylor was a music critic and composer, which was why it makes a lot of sense for him to be here, taking us through the different sequences of Fantasia and also giving us some of his commentary. For him, his career included being a music critic for the New York World, and he also composed an opera for the Metropolitan Opera, so he's pretty cool in the music scene. And then the conductor is Leopold Stokowski, who apparently was dining at the same restaurant as Walt Disney, and Walt Disney just pulled up a chair at his table and started telling him about this great idea he had for a animated musical piece. And Leopold was interested and offered to conduct the Philadelphia Orchestra, which is the orchestra you hear in this film. Although the people that you see playing instruments, I believe, are actors, miming the motions.
With a name like Leopold Stokowski, did he ever have any other options besides becoming a conductor? When I imagine a high-class conductor, his name is Leopold Stokowski. So let's talk a little bit about that, because these are obviously very high art individuals, respected, and not cartoon people. And I feel like this movie, from moment one, is trying as hard as it possibly can to say, this is art. This is respected and inimitable filmmaking.
Well, yeah, I think that's very interesting because it's not like Disney hadn't been marrying music and cartoons before. The silly symphonies are built on this idea of a bunch of antics for 5 to 7 minutes and cute, fun, ridiculous characters entertaining you for a little while. But Fantasia is something completely different and is definitely stepping away from those previous pieces.
I think it very clearly sets a tone for itself with its first movement, which is, rather than starting on something fun and familiar, I would have been tempted to start on Sorcerer's Apprentice, or perhaps the Dance of the Hours, the cartoon animal ballet, something that felt a little more classical, silly symphony. They start in a very abstract place, and I think that's a very conscious choice to make this their bid to be high art in the upper echelons of cinema.
Well, from a very modern perspective, I like that they start with the abstract stuff, because it's this moment for meditation for the audience to kind of bring them into this weird and interesting world where we just want you to sit and listen to the music and let your mind wander, let it be free, let it be open to all of the weird and interesting images that we are about to show you on screen. And there's also something very ASMR about that moment, about even just opening with the live action, letting the orchestra come and take their seats and pick up their bows and shuffle their sheet music.
It is often said that Fantasia was ahead of its time. I don't think I've ever heard it was ahead of its time because no one had thought of ASMR yet.
Yeah, but bringing up the abstract way that it opens, apparently Disney got the idea to make abstract animation after watching something called A Color Box by Len Lye, and you can find that on YouTube. I'll put a link to it in the show notes.
We definitely watched something by Len Lye in animation history.
Yeah, apparently A Color Box was a commercial, actually. I'm not entirely sure what it was for, but I've seen just a couple bits and pieces, and there's something very lovely and meditative, I think, about watching abstract animation. I really, really enjoy abstract animation.
So, actually, this idea wasn't simply for one film. Walt had ultimately hoped to have Fantasias come into theaters year after year with new segments appearing periodically, old favorites coming back, a kind of evolving repertoire of music and animation. An idea which was absolutely shot to hell when the movie failed financially.
Well, but part of the problem is that RKO decided not to distribute the film, and so it only ended up in 12 theaters when it opened, and you can't make a profit on 12 theaters. Not to mention, once again, same problem as Pinocchio, World War II is beginning, and you can't get to the European market. One of the articles I was looking at said that was about 45% of the revenue that Disney would have expected to get. So, unfortunately, that does lead to why Dumbo, the next film, has a much smaller budget. And watching Dumbo, I think you can really tell how things have shifted.
Yeah, it is quite sobering to realize that Disney was doing this incredible artistic achievement, putting these films together, releasing them into a black hole of, one of the worst times that human civilization will ever see.
We pray.
Yeah. And we now regard them as these incredible classics, and it's really great that they remain with us and we can appreciate them better now, because none of them really, after Snow White, coming into a receptive time for them. And I feel like that really limited Disney's ability to produce the great work that he was capable of right out the gate, and that's why there is such a slog coming up of the Fun and Fancy Free and Three Caballeros and Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Crane, which were not Disney at its height.
No, but at the same time, I do find Walt Disney's story extremely inspiring, because most people would have put the towel in the can at that point. I'm mixing metaphors, sorry.
I'm going to use that from now on. That's great.
They would have thrown in the towel at this point, because you're working at such a massive scale. You're pulling out humongous loans from the bank that would, give anyone a heart attack. But he is still tackling things and saying, even though that didn't work, I love this and I believe in this and I have to tell these stories and I want things like this to be out there for the public. And moving on to, okay, what's the next thing and how do I make that happen? How do I convince people to stay on this train with me and keep funding this train? And to know that these things didn't succeed when they come out. From an artist perspective, where we're always so worried about, oh my gosh, this thing I'm making, is it going to succeed? Are people going to like it? The stuff that we now consider classics were not received terribly well when they came out. And you know what? They have lived on.
We should all be so lucky that our big gambles and financial failures will eventually be redeemed by a bunch of teenagers taking LSD in the 60s and making our movies box office successes.
Fantasia finally did make its profit in 1969, thanks to the young people of the day who enjoyed its psychedelic stylings.
We perhaps then did not appreciate the movie at its fullest, taking it mostly sober. But what are your mostly sober overall impressions?
I love Fantasia so much. I can't tell you how much I love this movie. It's weird and it's interesting, and yes, it's psychedelic, but it's just doing so many interesting things and really getting to like a primal core of our brains where music and color and sound collide. I started watching this movie as a very young child, I think before I really even had conscious thought, which I think everyone should be showing Fantasia to their very, very tiny toddler babies, because it's all about sound and feeling and also introducing children to classical music. And the most receptive I have ever been to classical music was when it was animated. This is the sort of stuff I love, and I'd love to make this every day, and I'd love people to enjoy it more, so I hope that everyone will go home and watch Fantasia if you haven't already.
All right, I have a confession to make. Listeners, I aspire to be the kind of person who loves classical music. I am the one who turns on NPR. And if I'm being totally honest, apart from the occasional burst of Beethoven or swoon of Mozart, I mostly remain unmoved by classical music. And, to some degree I consider that a personal failing, but that is very similar to how I respond to Fantasia. I would never criticize it. I think it's a marvel. I think it should be considered a classic. I think it should be shown to children, but it's kind of hard for me to pay attention to it.
I mean, I don't love classical music on its own, but I'm more than happy to listen to it when I get to hang out with centaurs and ballerina dancing hippopotamuses.
Hippopotami?
Probably.
Or maybe it's just one of those continually plurals. Maybe it's like 5 hippopotamus.
What is the hippopotamus of a triangle?
I've never met a hippopotamus that looks like a triangle. They are very round.
I don't know. I have a deep-seated love of this movie, and it is very much stored in just the weird pre-thought recollections and feelings. And I've told Nathan this story before, but Fantasia is one of those movies where I got to look at myself, because I would occasionally pop this into the VCR. I'd been watching this movie. I could totally sit through the entire thing without a problem whatsoever. But suddenly at 5 or 6 years old, I started to feel so heavily during especially the dinosaur scene. I couldn't finish it. I had to fast forward through it. I had to stop, and then I had to fast forward through the rest of that entire segment because I was so overcome with terrifying emotions that I couldn't watch the T-Rex and the Stegosaurus fight. And I knew what was going to happen because I'd seen the movie before, and I had to look at myself at 6 years old and say, wow, I have developed fear. And very strange to recognize in yourself as a small child.
Most children become aware of death through dead dog books. Alexa became aware of death through dead dinosaur shorts.
The dinosaurs are really cool, though.
They are. Do we want to start going through the different segments? It's a hard movie to kind of discuss on a big picture level because the segments are so different. We talked a little bit about the opening earlier. It's a framing device in the classical Disney style. All these films have some kind of framing device, and it's very much a high art, take this seriously framing device. But it's lovely in its own way. I do love the colors and the silhouettes and the lights and the way they framed the musicians, the way they cross-dissolve in an almost abstract pattern. If you really watch the way that the silhouettes cross between musicians, they start to feel like shapes in their own right, which prefigures the way shapes are used in the abstract sequence to follow.
They do start off with a lot of color theory and cuts on the music so that when you get to the animated portion, it feels very natural.
I remembered the abstract sequence being a bit more abstract than it is. I feel like there's always a sense of environment to it, like sky and clouds and light moving around. The actual portion of the abstract sequence that is just shapes appearing on screen is very short.
As a kid, I felt like the segment was so long. It felt like an eternity. And then watching it this time around, it was so fast. I was like, oh, that was only like 10 seconds for each shape.
We should say, of course, that when we say the abstract piece, we mean the Toccata and Fugue in D minor by Johann Sebastian Bach. What my musician friends have always said over the years about Bach is that he's a very mathematical composer. He has these phrases that recur over and over and over again, but they shift ever so slightly every time they recur. And so I think it's a really appropriate composer to be using for this slightly more geometric and abstract piece.
In this part, I really like the bulbous hills that go by, And towards the end, there are these rays of light that kind of get turned on in different areas until it's just flooded with this angelic rays of light. And those are the pieces that I enjoyed most in this segment. Do you recall any of the abstract animations that you enjoyed on screen?
I can't say it really left me with strong impressions. So we move on fairly quickly from the Toccata and Fugue to the Nutcracker Suite, which I have to say I think it's quite bold of them to take the Nutcracker Suite by Tchaikovsky and not do anything related to the original visual source material of the Nutcracker Ballet.
But the Nutcracker Suite is definitely one of the few classical pieces I think that you could ask me to hum, and I would actually have something for you.
Hey Alexa, hum the Nutcracker Suite for me.
Dun 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 dun.
Very good.
Bravo.
So the Nutcracker Suite, familiar to all of us?
Directed by Samuel Armstrong, just so we know. I love this piece personally because there's so many vignettes happening in it. It isn't really an overall story. You just get these really interesting peeks at magic in nature. And we do follow a lot of fairies through this segment, which is kind of cool to think about that these are Tinkerbell's ancestors.
I will say, I think this and the Night on Bald Mountain / Ave Maria sequence at the end of the film are the ones that most speak to me. I do really appreciate the way that the fairies here are less cute side characters and more the life force of nature. They are the fae spirit that moves through the woodlands and brings the flowers to life and, settles them down into their winter rest. And it's very, very lovely, very evocative, very pleasantly pagan.
I love the idea that it's some fairy's job to go around putting morning dew on everything. Like, that sounds like a great job. Can I just quit my career now and become a fairy that's a dew fairy?
And that morning dew, it's so beautifully rendered.
They just make everything glitter.
Mm-hmm. It really is. This sequence has a lot of moments that feel like a soft, gentle fireworks show. It's so sparkly and, And I guess when you think about the way that all of these effects match with the music, like that's how a good fireworks show should work. It should hit on the beats with the big, bright splashes of color and shapes. And this piece is it's such a marvel. I found myself thinking a lot about the way that it's very painterly. When you compare it to the look of characters in Snow White and Pinocchio, where there's a very classic animation style that is uniformly used because it's manageable and affordable, where there's a clean ink outline of every character, and then they are filled in with blocks of color. And you do that because it's very easy to keep that consistent. Painting animation is a lot more difficult and a lot easier to lose track of the defined edges of the subject and therefore of the movement that you want to convey. But a lot of the fairies moving about, it really has that painterly quality. They are bursts of colors loosely etched into the frame. You can almost see the brush strokes that make them up. And it's really beautiful work.
And then we get to the mushrooms.
Yeah, the flowers and the mushrooms and the fish dancing in this piece are, I know they brought in dancers to study and figure out how to transform that movement into natural shapes, and they do such great work. They just imbuing these inanimate objects with such life and character.
Personality.
Yeah.
The personality of the mushrooms is so very different from the personalities of the fish. I'm so charmed by these mushrooms. That's always my favorite portion of this entire piece. And then you go into the water with the fish and they're in their own very ethereal world. This movie makes me so sleepy. And this is one of those portions, the fish moving around, just watching their fins kind of move across the screen as, you go this way and that. In animation we call an S-curve. In secondary motion, when hair or a scarf is flying in the wind and you watch it flutter, it makes those S movements, and I could just fall asleep to that.
And the translucency of those fins. Oh.
It's gorgeous. It's absolutely gorgeous.
Ravishing.
Exactly. But these fish have very beautiful eyes and very big lips. They're very sexy fish.
It is a very sexy fish.
When we get to the flower people who dance, the kind of folk dance, which is also very lively after we've had this very sleepy fish portion. But they remind me very much of Alice in Wonderland, just from a design standpoint, but also the fact that they just like burst and get up and move seems like something that we could have stuck into Alice in Wonderland and just had her watching them. It wouldn't have been out of the ordinary at all.
Yeah, when you need to inject some intense energy into a piece, always bring in the Russian dancing, even if the Russian dancing is being done by upside-down flowers.
And on a very personal note, to get to the end of this segment, we watch the fairies at the beginning with the morning dew, and they're going through the different seasons to autumn, and eventually they get to winter, and these beautiful frost sprites get to cover everything in a beautiful glittering frost. And that's when the music starts to crescendo as we get to the end of the piece. And as someone with a December birthday, it made me feel very, very proud to be someone who would be a December fairy.
Oh, that reminds me. One of the things I found myself thinking during the winter segment of this sequence is, ooh, those snowflakes. If we were making this film today, they would be computer animated because they are so geometrically fine-tuned. That must have been such a pain to draw. They apparently drew them and then used some kind of motor system to rotate the cells in front of the camera.
Really?
To create that snowflake effect.
I was wondering, because I looked at it and I was like, that feels really CG, but it couldn't possibly be.
Yeah. It was a very, very early kind of mechanical hand-drawn hybrid.
Oh, it's gorgeous. It's so beautiful.
We move on from there to the Sorcerer's Apprentice.
With music by Paul Dukas, who I had never heard of before.
Yeah, he's not one of those iconic classical composers you hear about.
Yeah, and we should also mention that this portion is directed by James Alger.
And the original Dukas piece is based on a pre-existing ballad narrative poem written by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe. It's a fairly faithful adaptation, except the sorcerer at the end of the von Goethe poem is a bit more understanding and gentle, a little less stern.
You mean he talks? Because Yensid doesn't talk.
Yensid, what a funny name.
Well, you know.
What don't I know?
You're supposed to know already that it's Disney spelled backwards.
What?
Crazy. What's actually very interesting to note is that apparently this music for The Sorcerer's Apprentice is the only piece to be used in both Fantasia and Fantasia 2000.
So The Sorcerer's Apprentice, it's the Mickey short.
And Mickey has just gotten a redesign. Once upon a time, Mickey Mouse just had black eyes, big black eyes. And now he has white eyes with black pupils so that you can get a lot more emotion out of him.
That is the design I assumed he always had. So, good job, Fantasia.
Have you not? You've seen Steamboat Willie.
I have. I don't think about Steamboat Willie very often.
This is the point where, around 1940-ish, Mickey does get that redesign, which feels very modern. You'll continue to see in Mickey and the Beanstalk and the Prince and the Pauper and things like that. And Mickey, I think, stays very much this way for a very long time.
As I was talking about earlier, this movie takes a little while to introduce to you the familiar Disney elements that you might be expecting. And this is, I think, the moment where it transitions into a audience-friendly film. And it's a delightful, simple little morality tale.
What is the moral?
The moral is don't meddle with power you don't understand. Or a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing.
Oh, that's not what I took away.
What did you take away?
Do your chores yourself.
Well, that is a very specific moral, but also applicable.
Well, I think we all know the feeling of, oh man, this thing is really hard. I wish I could just push it off on someone else. And being able to conjure up some hands out of a broom to sweep up the kitchen for me and do the dishes for me sounds really nice.
Another moral you might be able to take from it. Taking shortcuts will come back to haunt you in the end.
Oh, yes. There's this really beautiful moment where Mickey has had to chop up the broom he created into tiny little splinter pieces. And
it's quite graphic.
Yeah, and we go to gray to really sell this moment of the death of the broom. But as the broom comes back to life, we get these little pulses of color as it comes back and reassembles and becomes an army of brooms. And it's really great how they make that sing.
And that the armies of brooms really are quite intimidating in their mass marching power.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. As an animation nerd, I realized during the segment how much I really love cycles. There's something about cycles that is just very calming to me, and I just want to watch cycles all day. And if you wanted to, you could just play this thing over and over and over again and have, millions of brooms walk down the stairs.
Millions of brooms walk downstairs does sound like an ASMR video.
Oh, it would sell really, really well if Disney made ASMR.
Elsa whispers at you as she creates snowflakes.
No, I mean literally making a gif of the brooms and then just making the swishy noises or something like that would be very nice.
Mm-hmm.
I find it very calming. In a world that causes me a lot of anxiety, it's very calming. Cycles are nice.
Mm-hmm. Right, that's why you should wake up the same way every morning and have the same meal and...
Cycles are for brooms.
Fair. The only other thought I really have about The Sorcerer's Apprentice is that sorcerer's eyes. They're like digging into his brow. They're terrifying.
I did not remember his eyes being that big. Like, the whites of his eyes are huge. Because he doesn't talk, and he just has to communicate through looks that he gives, which are very condescending, reprimanding looks at Mickey.
As a parent, you really should work on that glare.
I'm not a parent.
When your children slacks off at their chores, you really got to be able to make them feel that guilt.
I'm going to have to enlarge my eye size by 100%.
We'll just hack into our children's augmented reality glasses so that it always appears that our eyes are intensely large.
Large eyes is normally a sign of cuteness, because normally things like My Little Ponies get large eyes. So for someone who is supposed to be intimidating to have eyes this large doesn't really fit with the way that we have started to typecast these design choices.
I do think it's because... he has a very intense, sloping, masculine brow, and so these giant eyes dig into that brow, so when he, furrows his eyebrows, it just, smashes down the giant eyeballs, and it's very, very disturbing.
At the end of this segment, Mickey is slinking away, and he feels very bad about what he's done. He knows he's in trouble. And then Yensid gives him this look before he sends a little bolt of magic after him to send Mickey running out of frame. Do you feel like that moment is malicious or mischievous?
Mischievous. There is a sense, at least I feel like there's a sense in which he has to put on a show of disapproval because these are dark and terrible magics that must be managed responsibly. But he's a little bit amused because it's kind of a funny story.
He's going to tell all of his wizard buddies at drinks tonight.
Oh, absolutely. He will tell so many pals about that over the years. So after The Sorcerer's Apprentice, we have The Rite of Spring, written by Igor Stravinsky, a.k.a. the musical number that taught Alexa about death and fear.
This music is just anxiety-inducing. How does this not put everyone into a panic attack? I think I shriveled up inside when this came on, and all of a sudden there were these beautiful volcanoes all exploding to the music, and
volcanoes make great drum beats.
It looked gorgeous visually, but just listening to the music was causing panic in my chest.
I really enjoyed how they introduced this piece as not art, but cold, hard science.
Yes, this segment was written by Cold Hard Science. Also directed by John Hubley, who I just happen to like because I remember a story being related in the history of animation course that I took at USC, that he and his wife, they had 2 rules in their marriage, and one of them was that they would always eat dinner together as a family, and the second rule was that every year they would make a film together. His wife continued to make films even after he had passed, and just that's the sweetest thing I've ever heard. That is true love.
Of course, if they were alive today, they would be making a podcast together.
Oh, wait, do we have to make a podcast together every year?
Well, this podcast is going to last forever, so easy. I believe Hubley went on to work with UPA and do much more abstract stylized animation than is present in this particular segment. Will be associated with a much more graphic and less realistic science-based type of animation.
Yeah, the UPA style is extremely different from the Disney style. Anyway, dinosaurs!
Dinosaurs. I think this really shaped a lot of children's imagination about dinosaurs. And it's this and the little rubber dinosaur action figures that I had as a kid that's what I imagine the prehistoric world looked like. I would be curious to see how much of the science represented in this film, the cold hard science, is now very inaccurate.
Yeah, 1940s science is very different from 2019's science. As a very young kid, I loved watching the dinosaur segment because of all of the cool dinosaurs that were on screen and moving. It was very magical, and you couldn't see this anywhere else, like only in animation. And they have so many different species represented on screen. There's my personal favorite is this like tiny sort of triceratopsy thing, but it's very boxy, and he's kind of like waddling between people's nests. I also call all of the dinosaurs by their names from the Land Before Time. There's a lot of long necks.
I think our cinematic imagination about dinosaurs is probably Fantasia until the Land Before Time, at which point it's the Land Before Time until Jurassic Park.
Yes, as we grow up. There's a fair amount of dinosaurs trying to eat food from other dinosaurs' mouths in this segment. They just kind of kept repeating that gag. It's like, it's not funny, but they kept doing it. And I'm like, did they think it was funny? The first time it was kind of funny, but then like 3 different dinosaurs try to eat food hanging out of someone else's mouth. This is gross. And then dinosaurs try to eat other dinosaurs. And I'm like, oh no.
I think it's not funny haha, but funny sad that so much of this segment, its tension derives from, will these dinosaurs escape from the Tyrannosaurus Rex? And they do, but they cannot escape mortality. Because shortly after the Tyrannosaurus Rex sequence, we witness all of them die from terrifying weather-based changes and the changing climate of the Earth, and this would make an excellent commercial for ending climate change.
Yeah, I find that a little interesting in that, you know, we always talk about how like the comet hit the Earth and wiped out the dinosaurs, and you imagine that what this means is that the impact of the comet simultaneously killed all of the dinosaurs. But what the short suggests is that the comet must have hit the Earth and then killed a lot of the vegetation and changed the climate, and now everything is a desert, and they're just going to slowly starve and die. Disney is always, you know, so associated with being uplifting and hopeful and bringing in the magic and the glitter and sparkle of tomorrow.
This is not magic, this is cold, hard science.
It's so weird to see this in a Disney film because it is so bleak. You're just waiting for the moment when it transitions away from this to tell me it's going to be okay. Tell me there's a tomorrow.
There is a tomorrow, and it's called the Pastoral Symphony by Ludwig van Beethoven.
I also love this segment.
This is, of course, as every child remembers, the one with centaurs in it.
The way that this particular segment is introduced is the Pastoral Symphony with the centaurs and their girlfriends, the centaurettes. And I can't tell you how much I was revolted inside. Also, by the way, originally the centaurettes were supposed to be completely nude, which for their female halves was very problematic with, you know, people and standards and practices who were like, no, you need to cover that with some well-placed garlands.
Ah, well-placed flowers. But they have saved so much cinema from standards and practices.
In the DVD release that we were watching, of course, when you start off the segment and they're in the waterfalls, there are still a few bare-chested centaurettes coming out of the water.
The world of centaurs is apparently one of extreme sexual dimorphism, where male centaurs are such bros.
They are
and
a
of course,
fraternity of centaurs.
The centaurettes are beautiful and lovely and love consists entirely of finding someone with a similar color palette.
That's how you know.
That's how you know. Essentially, the plot of the Pastoral Symphony segment is the exercise you give young children where they're supposed to match color blocks together.
Hey, I happen to really love the Pegasus that we start off this film with the...
That actually is my favorite part.
Think about it. There's a white mama, and then their father is a black, red-eyed Pegasus. White is the absence of color, and black is all of the colors. So, of course, together, they just have a spectrum of babies, which is delightful.
They really reminded me of Yoshi's from Super Mario Brothers. Their particular spectrum of colors of little baby Pegasi.
Of course, the one with the most personality is the Oreo-colored one. It's very cute and adorable and is struggling to be a good Pegasus and keep up with the flock.
I definitely remember this segment as being one which I really enjoyed as a child. I enjoyed the mythology of it. I enjoyed the fantasy qualities of it. But watching it now, I think it has a bit more of a meandering quality, and it doesn't necessarily track with the music in the same exciting ways that a lot of the others do. It's soft and gentle and pleasant to look at, but it's not one of my favorites now as an adult, even though I think it probably was my favorite as a child.
Well, I think as a child it was just very imaginative in a fantasy world that you would love to go visit. But with a modern lens and as an adult, it has less to offer. It is widely known that there are some problematic portions to this piece that have been cut out in subsequent releases of the film for good reason.
It is widely known to people who are not me. Alexa mentioned this during our viewing of this film. There were some very insensitive depictions of a particular black centaur character. There remain in the film some zebra centaurs who are also black, and actually I think quite elegant and lovely, and so I looked at those and thought, oh, this was controversial. It wasn't until we pulled up the images of the centaurettes that have been removed from the DVD release of this film that I realized exactly what Alexa's referring to here, and they are terrible.
Oof. Oh boy.
It is straight out of a racist minstrel show illustration handbook.
Yeah, so all for the better that those have been removed as tastefully as possible. And on YouTube, you can actually see a side-by-side comparison, which I would have never known that this character, was supposed to help unroll the red carpet for, what's his name, Dionysus?
If it's Greek, it's Dionysus. If it's Roman, it's Bacchus, or the other way around. I've forgotten.
Let's go with Bacchus. So this character was supposed to help unroll the red carpet for Bacchus up to his throne as he arrives to preside over the wine making. And in the DVD release that we have, of course, it just looks like the red carpet is magically unrolling. When you look at the side-by-side comparison, you can see how something is missing, but all for the better.
Absolutely. I don't necessarily think that a company or a brand should try to scrub its mistakes from history such that we may never learn from them again. But I think in a piece like Fantasia, which really can be passed on to generations and generations of children, I am really grateful to have a version that I feel comfortable passing on to my children.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to continue to pass out copies of Fantasia, I think, with something that is so hurtful.
Yeah.
And there is still always going to be the knowledge that thing happened. Like, it's still on YouTube. The internet never forgets. And so I think that can be used as a teachable tool in order to illustrate what is wrong with this and why we should never do this in the future. But without context, allowing that to continue on would be far more detrimental than it would do any good.
Absolutely. So, moving on to The Dance of the Hours by Amilcare Ponchielli.
So this portion is directed by Norman Ferguson and Thornton He. And what I really enjoyed about this portion, we're finally getting out of the box of what a ballerina is supposed to be. There's a long history about how ballerinas can only be a woman of a certain figure. It's so terribly interesting to me that we start off with ostriches who have knees that go backwards in relation to humans. And so they're performing ballet positions, but their knees are the wrong way. I enjoyed that a lot. And then we go into the hippopotamus section, where this is the extremely incorrect body type for a ballerina, and yet here they are.
Ballerinas are not supposed to have large animal snouts and tiny ears sticking out of the top of their head. It's true.
And tiny tails. I also enjoyed how the entire ostrich section was about snacks. They all just wanted to eat snacks out of the cornucopia, and they're very interested in the grapes. But also I feel like someone should really feed these ostriches because they're getting really excited about fruit in a way that I've never seen anyone get excited about fruit.
I get excited about fruit. Listeners, I put sliced dates on my vanilla ice cream tonight, and it was the most delicious thing I've ever eaten.
Yeah, but there was ice cream. No one gets that excited about a date. Well, okay, fine, but...
I don't know, I recall being pretty excited about some dates about 5 years ago.
Oh, but we also had a very heated debate during this segment of whether the hippopotamus was wearing a yellow or a green tutu. I say the tutu is yellow, and Nathan kept trying to say that the tutu was green. Listeners, I leave it to you.
I do not remember this argument, but I was apparently very passionate about it.
You were very insistent that it was green.
I will side with past Nathan and say green.
And then all of the alligators come out to play. And I think I finally understood that the different animals for the different portions of this song were meant to represent the different hours of the day, which harkens back to the Nutcracker Suite, where the different fairies were meant to represent different times of the year. The alligators seem to be the very dark hours of the night, which is when I am most awake.
Yes, when I wake up each morning, I feel awkward and uncoordinated. And then I have some coffee, so I'm really jittery. So that's when I'm an ostrich. And then after a lunch that's just too big, I just feel, bloated and slow like a hippopotamus. And then in the evening, I feel scaly and predatory. No, I don't. That doesn't track.
No, I think the alligators are meant to be like when you are supposed to be asleep, but you're out and partying at 2 a.m. And that's when the alligators are dancing. So
yeah, they're a little bit lascivious, the alligators, the way they look at the hippos, and it's a little hard to tell whether it's because they want to eat them or because they want to seduce them.
I think they want to eat them. Oh wait, we forgot about the elephants.
Oh right,
the elephants. How dare you forget the elephants? The elephants didn't forget you.
We're experts,
We're extremely experts. But talk about feeling sleepy during this. The hippopotamus goes to sleep in the middle of this segment. I was like, oh yeah, no, that's what I'd really like to be doing right now. This music is very nice and lovely, and you're sleeping, and I'd like to be sleeping. What are you, Nathan?
I'm an ostrich.
You're an ostrich?
Mm-hmm. Aww. Gangly and uncoordinated and just really passionate about fruit.
A snack time ostrich.
Yes.
Okay.
And always hungry.
Alligators are hungry too, Let me tell you how hungry I am. All right, and after the Dance of the Hours comes the big finale.
The big finale.
Night on Bald Mountain, followed by Ave Maria by Modest Mussorgsky.
I do think that, the subconscious seeds planted by this particular combination of sequences that I received as a child is probably the reason I'm religious today.
Do tell.
I mean, the Night on Bald Mountain sequence is really intense and transfixing and terrifying. I remember being really unnerved by Chernabog as a child and by the terrors and horrors of this sequence. And the way that it is so beautifully and thoughtfully plays that transition as Chernabog is at the height of his powers, and then the subtle, slow, quiet insistence of church bells robs him of his terror and his nightmares, and he is forced into a still and untroubling state. And then you have the slow, beautiful, soft, glowing Ave Maria pilgrimage sequence. And, it just really plants those seeds of how do you deal with the terrors of temptation and the dark horrors of the world through ritual and hope and prayer.
Chernobog just wants to dance, man. He just wants all of his buddies to dance, all of his flame ladies to dance.
Yeah, and he's, there's a reason he is, despite being a character from a musical sequence in a very, very atypical Disney film, is still considered one of the iconic Disney villains, because it's a pretty spectacular design.
Oh, it's a fantastic design.
And he has a lot of character and personality.
I think he'd actually make a really great Halloween decoration, like to have like a giant Chernobog coming up over your house. Be very tasteful.
Mm-hmm.
I enjoyed the floating skeletons. They were quite ghostly and fun. Went on for a bit, actually. A lot longer than I thought they would. Something that felt very historical about watching them come out of, the old graves at the churchyards and whatnot, and being called up to Chernobog. I love the artist Bosch, Hieronymus Bosch. He's the weirdest thing to come out of the Middle Ages, or the Middle Ages or Renaissance.
He would be, late Middle Ages? He might be a little early Renaissance. I don't know.
Yeah, but he's like the weirdest thing to come out of that time period in painting. He's like nothing else. And so these designs for the demons like very much seem to harken back to that. They were very appealing to me as an artist.
Well, we're trying not to curse in this podcast, so I can't relate the exact content of the notes that I took during this segment. But it actually says, this is some Hieronymus Bosch... Boop. Yes, it's a really great demon design. I really enjoy the way that Chernobog almost kind of mocks and perverts his little flame demons and turns them from something, elegant and beautiful into something comical and grotesque.
Of course, having the entire Disney library up to 2019, my brain instantaneously goes to the Hunchback of Notre Dame's Hellfire segment, where we have sexy Esmeralda dancing in the flames. And I'm just like, oh, I feel like this is where that came from, is these sexy fire ladies who are dancing in the hand of Chernobog.
Frollo really could have used Chernobog to turn those sexy Esmeralda temptations into goofy gargoyle grotesque monsters.
The gargoyles were upstairs the entire time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then it transitions from there into the Ave Maria sequence, which is
lovely.
A lot less complex, maybe, than some of the other pieces, but the environmental design on it is really unique and visually striking. The way that the trees have an almost Gothic architecture quality to them, like cathedral arches. There's something about its look that I find you won't really see again in Disney until Sleeping Beauty. A lot of the way the backgrounds look there remind me a lot of the illustrated manuscript look of Sleeping Beauty's backgrounds.
Very tall trees in that segment.
Mm-hmm.
So this is the end of the film, and after the crazy dancing of Night on Bald Mountain and Chernobog and whatnot, this is a really nice way to kind of cool down as we prepare to end the film and exit the theater.
I actually expected them to go back to the orchestra and our regular explaining characters, but they don't. They fade out very gracefully from the Ave Maria segment, and that's it.
Oh, see, I felt like that was super abrupt, that they dumped us back on the DVD menu. I was like, wait, what? It's over? There wasn't a goodbye?
There's not even end credits in classic movies, so, there's certainly not a post-credit sting.
For Fantasia 2000. What's the moral of Fantasia?
The moral of Fantasia is... don't party too hard. I think that bears out on a lot of the segments, really. Don't party too hard. Having fun is dangerous.
Well, if you've partied too hard, you can't outrun the lightning bolt strikes from Zeus.
Yeah, and...
it's very inconvenient.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the moral of Fantasia is that sleep is very important. There's a lot of sleeping in this movie.
and there are parts of it that make me want to sleep.
Zeus eventually, after throwing his lightning bolts down, gets tired and wraps himself up in a big dark cloud.
Oh, that image is so pure id. Like, how many times have you just thought, oh, I want to wrap myself in a cloud and go to sleep?
And all the little Pegasus go back to their nest, and their mom covers them with a wing. Everyone settles in for sleepy time. The hippopotamus on her lounge. So much sleepiness.
But I think we're ignoring the real moral of Fantasia, which is Walt Disney is an artist.
It's
Dang
art.
It. Animation is an art form.
It is.
It is,
though.
I believe that genuinely. And I do think that our cinematic output in America would be much richer if we didn't think that animation was just kid stuff. And I think in a world where Fantasia was more successful than it was, we might have had a bit more adult, not in the tawdry sense, but in the sophisticated sense, animation in the world.
I want to live in that world.
In any case, if you would like to live in that world, at the very least, you can listen to us talk about animation like it is a sophisticated art form. So thank you for listening. If you enjoyed our podcast, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or your preferred podcast player. You can write us at retroscoping@gmail.com or find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at retroscoping.
And you can also watch along with us. Our next podcast episode is going to be about Dumbo. So put that in your queue and watch it.
Thanks for listening, and
go live happily ever after. Bye.
Bye-bye.
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 Bye-bye now.
Bye. Bye.